This is a localized broadcast to all remaining camps. Welcome to Tales from the Wasteland. We don't have much time before the signal drops, so lock the doors, secure the feed by hitting like and subscribe, and let's begin. Everyone in the valley thought I was losing my mind. They'd drive past my property, slow down, and point at the massive, reinforced concrete barn I was building on the ridge. I could see them laughing from the cab of their trucks. In a small, tight-knit community, spending your life savings on industrial-grade steel beams, air filtration units, and hydro-powered generators instead of new tractors makes you a pariah. They called it the Pariah's Ark, but I didn't care. I felt it in my bones, a deep, persistent ache that the world was sitting on a powder keg. I just didn't expect the spark to be what it was. Beneath the floorboards of that barn, hidden under a hydraulic lift that looked completely ordinary, sat a state-of-the-art fallout shelter. It had 12-inch thick, reinforced walls, a hydroponic garden bay, a deep well water filtration system, and enough freeze-dried rations to last 3 people a decade. I designed it to survive a nuclear winter. It ended up saving us from a biological hell. The night the lights died. It started on a Tuesday in late autumn. The air was crisp, and the leaves were bleeding shades of rust and gold. I was in the bunker, calibrating the air intake valves, when my radio started spitting static. Marcus, are you there? Turn on the feed. Please tell me you're looking at this." It was Leo, my closest friend and a local paramedic. His voice wasn't just panicked, it was completely unraveled. I've known Leo since we were kids. The man had a stomach of iron and a heart of stone. Hearing him hyperventilate sent a spark of adrenaline straight to my chest. "I'm here, Leo," I said, grabbing the radio receiver. "Calm down. What's going on?" "It's not a riot, Marcus. The news is saying it's a civil disturbance, but it's not. I'm at the hospital near the highway interchange. They're tearing each other apart. People are waking up after dying. They aren't stopping. The police are firing on them and they just keep walking." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the concrete room. Then a massive thud echoed from upstairs. Something had just crashed into the main doors of my barn. Seconds to midnight, I bolted up the ladder, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I breached the hidden hatch and stepped into the dim, cavernous expanse of the barn. Outside, the world was bathed in an eerie, flickering orange glow. The power grid was already failing. Through the reinforced glass window of the barn's heavy oak doors, I saw her. It was Sarah, a young woman who worked at the supply store down the road. Her clothes were torn, soaked in a dark, slick fluid that looked almost black under the moonlight. She was clutching her arm, weeping, her eyes wide with a primal, naked terror. Behind her, out on the main road, headlights smeared across the darkness as cars collided. Distant screams, sharp and agonizing, pierced the night air. And then I saw what was chasing her. 3 figures emerged from the tree line. They didn't run like men. They lurched, their limbs jerking with an unnatural, violent hunger. One of them had its jaw completely unhinged, trailing a glistening ribbon of crimson. "Marcus, open the door, please!" Sarah screamed, her hands smearing blood across the glass. My hand hovered over the heavy steel deadbolt. Every survival instinct I had cultivated over the last 5 years screamed at me to lock it, to retreat into the earth and let the world burn. If she was bitten, she was a liability. If I opened that door, I was risking everything. But looking into her eyes, I knew that if I let her die out there, the monster inside the barn would be worse than the ones outside. I threw the deadbolt, grabbed her by the jacket, and yanked her inside just as a decaying mass of teeth and fingernails slammed into the oak door. The descent. "Hold your breath," I yelled, slamming the door shut and throwing 3 separate deadbolts into place. The wood groaned as the things outside began to throw their body weight against it, scratching and howling like starved animals. Sarah collapsed onto the sawdust-covered floor, sobbing hysterically, clutching a jagged laceration on her forearm. "Did they bite you?" I demanded, kneeling beside her, my voice harsher than I intended. "Sarah, look at me. Did those things bite you?" "No," No, I swear, she choked out, holding up her arm. I fell through a glass window, escaping the pharmacy. Marcus, my mom, they just started biting people. The dead, they're walking. Before I could answer, the heavy wooden doors groaned violently. A hairline fracture appeared in the center panel. The barn wasn't going to hold them forever. This wasn't a nuclear blast. It was a siege. We need to go, now, I said, lifting her to her feet. I led her to the back of the barn, activated the hydraulic lift, and revealed the heavy, pristine vault door of the bunker. To Sarah, it looked like entering another dimension, a sterile, brightly lit sanctuary of steel and survival, hidden beneath a rustic wooden frame. As we stepped across the threshold, I looked back at the barn doors one last time. A pale, decaying hand broke through the wood, grasping blindly at the empty air. I slammed the vault door shut, spun the heavy locking wheel until it clicked into place, and sealed us away from the end of the world. But, as the heavy silence of the bunker washed over us, I realized one terrifying truth. We were safe, but we were completely, utterly alone. And eventually, we would have to go back out. The silence inside the bunker was absolute. Outside, a modern dark age had begun, but beneath 12 inches of reinforced concrete, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the air filtration system and Sarah's ragged, uneven breathing. The air down here smelled of ozone, fresh paint, and the sterile tang of medical alcohol. I guided Sarah to the stainless steel examination table in the corner of the living quarters. She was trembling so violently that her teeth clicked together. "Sit," I said softly, my voice sounding strangely flat in the sealed room. "Let me look at that arm." She sat, pulling her torn jacket away from her forearm. The wound was ugly, a jagged, deep laceration from the pharmacy window she had shattered to escape. It was caked with dirt and dried blood, but as I washed it out with saline, I breathed a quiet sigh of relief. No teeth marks, no jagged tears from fingernails, just a clean, sharp slice from a pane of glass. "You're lucky," I muttered, applying a thick layer of antiseptic before stitching the skin closed. "A few inches deeper and you would have hit an artery." "Lucky?" Sarah laughed, a brittle, choked sound that threatened to turn into hysteria. "Marcus, everyone I know is dead, or worse. I watched Mr. Henderson from the bakery. He was on top of his wife. He was eating her, Marcus, and she was still screaming. Don't tell me I'm lucky." I didn't argue with her. I couldn't. I tied off the final suture, taped a clean gauze pad over the wound, and stepped back. "Get some rest," I said, pointing to one of the 3 built-in bunks along the wall. "The door is sealed. Nothing on earth is getting through that vault. You're safe here." She didn't move toward the bed. Instead, her eyes wandered around the bunker, taking in the rows of neatly labeled crates, the hydroponic trays where lettuce and dwarf tomato plants grew under artificial UV lights, and the wall of monitors displaying camera feeds from the surface. "They all called you crazy," she whispered, her voice hollow. "In town, they said you were a paranoid freak building a tomb. Turns out I was building a lifeboat," I replied. "Now get some sleep." Voices in the static. I moved to the command console, slipping on a heavy pair of radio headphones. The monitor setup was my window to a dying world. I had 8 cameras disguised as rusted hardware and nesting boxes positioned around the perimeter of the barn upstairs. I flicked through the feeds. On camera 1, which faced the main driveway, I could see them. There were at least a dozen now. They walked with a horrific, jerky asymmetry, shuffling through the dark. One of them slammed its forehead against the barn door, over and over, completely indifferent to the fact that its skull was fracturing under the impact. They didn't feel pain. They didn't tire, they just wanted in. I turned my attention to the shortwave radio, tuning through the emergency frequencies. For the first 2 hours, it was a chaotic symphony of terror. National Guard dispatches shouting over gunfire, emergency broadcast loops playing an automated synthetic voice, telling citizens to shelter in place, and air traffic controllers trying to manage a sky full of planes that had nowhere to land. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the dispatches stopped, the automated loops cut out, the airwaves bled into white noise. Then a voice broke through the static. It wasn't a soldier or an official. "Is anyone out there?" The radio crackled. It was a man's voice, raspy and breathless. "If anyone can hear this, we're holed up in the hardware store off the main bypass. There are 6 of us. We have no water. The things, they're throwing themselves at the glass. They're breaking through. Please, If anyone has a vehicle, if anyone has weapons. A sharp, deafening crash echoed through the radio speaker, followed by the sound of shattering glass. They're in. Oh God, they're in. Shoot them. Shoot them in the... A chorus of throat-tearing shrieks drowned out the man's voice. Gunshots fired in rapid succession, followed by the sickening wet sound of tearing flesh, and a final gurgling scream. Then the radio went dead. I sat there in the dim glow of the monitors, my hands gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to help. I wanted to radio back. But what could I do? Open the vault, walk into a swarm of monsters and die alongside them? You can't save them, Marcus, a voice said from behind me. I turned around. Sarah was standing there, wrapped in a wool blanket, her face pale. She had been listening. I know, I said, turning off the radio receiver. But listening to them die makes this place feel less like a bunker and more like a casket. The uninvited guest. 3 days passed in a blur of forced routine. We checked the water filtration system, tended to the hydroponic crops, and watched the monitors. The horde outside the barn had grown to roughly 30. They lingered like vultures, drawn by some residual scent or the memory of the prey that had slipped through their fingers. On the fourth morning, a sudden alert chimed on the main console. A motion sensor on the back perimeter of the property had been tripped. I quickly brought up camera 4, which faced the dense woods behind the barn. A man was sprinting through the trees, his breath pluming in the cold morning air. He was clutching a bolt-action rifle to his chest, his winter coat shredded. Behind him, crashing through the underbrush, were 5 infected. They were closing the distance fast. "Marcus, look," Sarah gasped, rushing to my side. "He's heading for the barn." As the man broke through the tree line, he stumbled over an exposed root, tumbling into the dirt. His rifle flew from his hands, sliding across the frost-covered grass. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees as the lead infected, a man who looked like he had once been a highway state trooper, lunged for him. The man pulled a heavy iron crowbar from his belt and swung it with terrifying, desperate strength. The blow caught the infected trooper square in the temple with a sickening crack. The creature collapsed, lifeless, into the dirt, but the other 4 were already upon him. "We have to help him," Sarah cried out, grabbing my shoulder. "Marcus, he's alive. He's fighting." I stared at the screen, my hand hovering over the remote release for the barn's rear emergency door. If I opened it, I could let him in, but the infected were right on his heels. If he didn't make it, I would be opening a direct pathway into my sanctuary for the horde. The man managed to kick another infected away, scrambling to his feet. He looked directly toward the barn, his face bruised and bloody. He didn't know I was watching through a hidden lens, but he ran straight for the rear wall, pounding his fists against the corrugated metal. "Please," his voice echoed faintly through the external microphone. "I know someone is in here. I saw the solar panels. I saw the reinforcement. Let me in." I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were begging me. I looked back at the monitor. The remaining 3 infected were less than 10 yards away from him, their jaws snapping, their eyes milky and dead. I made my choice. I slammed my hand down on the hydraulic release. "Get ready," I told Sarah, drawing the heavy 9mm pistol from my holster. "If anything else comes through that door, you flatten yourself against the wall." The heavy steel rear door of the barn slid open with a low hiss. The rear door didn't slide open silently. The heavy hydraulics groaned under the strain of days of neglect, a sound that felt deafening in the crisp morning air. The man didn't hesitate. He dived through the opening, rolling across the concrete floor of the barn just as a pair of gray, decayed hands clawed at the closing gap. The steel door slammed shut with a heavy, pressurized thud, severing the fingers of the lead infected. A sickening dry crunch echoed through the room as the severed digits fell to the floor, twitching in the dust. I stood at the top of the bunker hatch, my 9mm pistol raised and locked onto the stranger's chest. Sarah stood a few feet behind me, holding a heavy iron wrench she'd grabbed from the workbench, her knuckles white. "Hands where I can see them," I shouted, my voice echoing off the high metal rafters of the barn. "Don't move a muscle." The man lay on his back, chest heaving violently, his face a map of exhaustion, dirt, and dried blood. He slowly raised his hands, letting the crowbar clatter to the concrete. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a jagged graying beard and eyes that had seen far too much death in the span of a single week. "I'm clean," he gasped, his voice raspy and raw. "I'm not bitten. I swear to God I'm not bitten." "Sarah, keep your distance," I ordered, never lowering my sight from his forehead. "Slide your jacket off," I told him. "Roll up your sleeves. Do it slowly." He complied without a fight, peeling off a heavy torn canvas jacket and rolling up the sleeves of his flannel shirt. His arms were covered in scratches and bruises from sprinting through the briars and thickets of the woods, but there were no puncture wounds, no teeth marks. "My name is Gavin," he said, breathing a bit easier as I lowered the pistol a fraction of an inch. I was a tactical coordinator for the county emergency services until the services stopped existing. "Are you alone, Gavin?" I asked, keeping my tone rigid, unyielding. "Yeah," Gavin muttered, a deep, hollow shadow crossing his face. "I'm alone. My team, we tried to set up a perimeter at the grid station down south. We were overrun in hours. I've been running through the woods for 2 days." He looked around the pristine, reinforced interior of the barn, his eyes finally landing on the open vault door glowing in the floorboards. "Jesus Christ, the rumors were true. You're the guy who built the fort." "It's a lifeboat," I said, repeating the words I'd told Sarah. "And right now it's full." "Stand up." Slowly. The third chair. We brought Gavin down into the bunker. After a thorough inspection in the airlock to ensure he wasn't hiding a bite mark under his boots, I handed him a bottle of purified water and a ration bar. He ate like a starving animal, barely chewing before swallowing. Sarah sat across from him at the small metal table, watching him with a mix of pity and fascination. "What's happening out there, Gavin? Is there anyone organizing a rescue? The radio went completely silent 3 days ago." Gavin finished the water, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked up, his eyes dead and heavy. "There is no rescue, kid," Gavin said bluntly. "The chain of command broke on day 2. The virus, or whatever the hell it is, it spreads through fluids, but it's airborne in high concentrations of decomposition. The major hubs fell first. The dense population centers became meat grinders in 48 hours. "What about the military?" I asked, leaning against the console, watching the camera monitors. On the screens, the infected outside were growing restless again, throwing themselves at the front doors, drawn by the sound of the rear door closing earlier. "The military is fighting a war with no front lines," Gavin replied, leaning back in his chair. "How do you hold a position when your own casualties get up and attack you from behind?" I watched a fallback point get wiped out because a soldier hit a bite from his squad. By midnight, he'd turned and torn out the throats of the night watch. "It's over. It's a total systemic collapse." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah looked down at her lap, her lip trembling. The faint, fragile hope she had been clinging to, that this was just a temporary disaster, that things would go back to normal, was shattered. "So what do we do?" she whispered. "We survive," I said, stepping forward. "We have food, we have water, we have power. This bunker can run for years without ever needing a single thing from the surface. We sit tight. We let the world outside rot itself out, and we wait." Gavin looked around the bunker, a grim, knowing smile playing on his lips. "You've got a beautiful setup here, Marcus, truly, but you made one critical mistake." I narrowed my eyes. "And what's that?" "You built a fortress," Gavin said, pointing a calloused finger at the monitors. "But you forgot that a fortress is only as good as its weakest point. Look at camera 2. The cracking shell." I spun around to the console, punching the keys to bring camera 2 into full focus. This camera was aimed at the main structural support beams on the eastern exterior of the barn. My blood ran cold. The infected weren't just wandering mindlessly anymore. There were easily over 50 of them now, packed tightly into the space between the barn and the old tool shed. Because of the narrow layout, their bodies were being crushed together by the sheer volume of the crowd pushing from behind. They were forming a human wedge, under the immense crushing pressure of dozens of bodies being forced against the wall by the relentless horde behind them. The corrugated iron siding of the barn was beginning to buckle. One of the heavy wooden support pillars, the very foundation holding up the roof above my bunker, was cracking. A long, splintering fissure was snaking its way up the wood. If that pillar snapped, The eastern wall of the barn would collapse inward. It wouldn't crush the bunker, the concrete vault was buried deep, but it would fill the upper barn with debris and dozens of infected. Worse, the intake valves for our air filtration system were located right on that eastern wall. If that wall falls, Gavin said, standing up and walking over to the monitor, his military eyes assessing the damage, your air vents will be buried in dust, debris, and rotting meat. Your pumps will burn out trying to pull oxygen through the rubble. You won't break the seal of this vault, Marcus, but you'll suffocate in it. I stared at the screen, watching the structural beam groan under the weight of the dead. Gavin was right. My perfect, impenetrable shelter had a ticking clock attached to it. We have to clear them, I said, my voice dropping an octave as the reality of the situation set in. We have to go back to the surface and clear that wall. Gavin reached down, picking up his iron crowbar from the floor, a dark, grim determination returning to his eyes. Then I suggest we get our weapons ready, because we're running out of time. The atmosphere inside the bunker shifted instantly from a safe haven to a claustrophobic pressure cooker. The rhythmic hum of the air filtration system, once a comforting sign of safety, now sounded like a countdown. We can't just walk out the front door, Gavin said, his voice sharp, taking control of the tactical reality. They're packed too tight. If we open that vault door and head up the stairs, we risk a bottleneck. If they push past us, they're down here in your living space. He's right, I muttered, pacing the concrete floor, my mind racing through the blueprints I had spent years drawing. I designed an emergency escape tunnel. It leads from the back utility room of the bunker, under the foundation, and breaks out inside the old silage silo 50 yards north of the barn. Sarah stood up, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. What do you want me to do, Marcus? I'm not staying down here while you two go up there. No, Sarah. You are staying down here, I countered, turning to face her. I need someone at the command console. If the filtration system starts to choke on dust, you need to manually switch it to the secondary internal scrubbing loop. If we get cut off, you're the only one who can operate the hydraulic overrides to let us back in. She looked like she wanted to argue, but the sheer logic of survival cut through her defiance. She nodded slowly, her hand resting on the metal table. Don't make me stay down here alone forever, Marcus. Come back. We will, I said. I walked over to the armory locker, throwing open the heavy steel doors. Inside sat the fruits of my paranoia. 2 tactical 12-gauge shotguns, a pair of semi-automatic rifles, and crates of ammunition. I handed a shotgun and a bandolier of shells to Gavin. He took the weapon, checked the chamber with a practiced, fluid motion, and nodded. Mossberg 500, reliable. It'll do the trick at close range, Gavin muttered. I slung a rifle over my shoulder, checked my 9mm sidearm, and grabbed a couple of heavy-duty commercial-grade road flares. If we needed a distraction, fire was always a universal language. Into the earth. Gavin and I moved to the utility room at the rear of the bunker. I pulled back a heavy rubber mat on the floor, revealing a circular padlocked steel hatch. I punched the combination into the lock, threw the latch, and lifted the heavy iron plate. A wave of cold, damp earth and stagnant air hit my face. A vertical ladder descended 10 feet into a narrow, concrete-lined pipe, just wide enough for a man to crawl through. I'll go first, I whispered. Keep your safety on until we hit the surface. I dropped down into the dark, switching on the tactical flashlight mounted beneath my rifle barrel. The beam sliced through the gloom, illuminating the damp, gray concrete walls of the crawlway. I began to crawl on my hands and knees, the metal of my rifle clinking softly against my gear. Gavin followed right behind, his heavy, rhythmic breathing echoing in the confined space. It took us 5 agonizing minutes to reach the end of the pipe. Above us was another ladder leading up to a wooden hatch. This was the floor of the old, abandoned concrete silo. I climbed the ladder, resting my shoulder against the wooden hatch. Slowly, carefully, I pushed it upward an inch. The crisp, freezing air of the outside world rushed into my lungs, tasting incredibly sweet after days of recycled bunker oxygen. I peered through the gap. The interior of the silo was empty, lit only by beams of morning light filtering through cracks in the roof. But outside, The air was thick with a sound that made my skin crawl, a low, collective, guttural groaning. It sounded like a stadium full of people sighing in unison, mixed with the wet, clicking sound of snapping teeth. I pushed the hatch fully open and climbed out, Gavin following seamlessly behind me. We crept to the broken wooden door of the silo, peering out toward the eastern wall of the barn. The thin red line. The situation was worse than the monitors had shown. The crowd of infected was a writhing, pulsing mass of gray flesh, torn clothing, and exposed bone. They were packed so tightly against the eastern wall that the corrugated metal sheets were screaming, the rivets popping out under the immense pressure like bullets. The main support beam was bowing outward, splintering with a terrifying crack every time the crowd surged. "There are too many to just shoot," Gavin whispered in my ear, his breath hot in the freezing air. "If we start firing from here, we'll just draw the ones from the front and get surrounded in this silo. We need to split them up. We need a diversion." I pulled a heavy road flare from my vest. "The old tool shed," I said, pointing to the small wooden structure about 30 yards away from the crowd. "It's full of dried firewood and old cans of kerosene I never moved. If I can ignite it, the sound and the heat might pull the back half of the crowd away from the wall." "And what about the front half?" Gavin asked, pumping his shotgun. "The front half gets the lead," I said. "Once the fire catches, we push hard from their flank. We clear the pressure off that wall before the beam snacks." "A high-stakes gamble," Gavin grimaced, a grim smirk playing on his lips. "I like it. Go. I'll cover your approach." I unpinned the flare, struck the cap against the abrasive strip, and a blinding, brilliant crimson fire erupted into the morning air, hissing violently. With all the strength I had left, I hurled the burning flare across the yard. It arched perfectly through the sky, shattering the small glass window of the tool shed and disappearing inside. For a moment, nothing happened. The groaning of the dead continued unabated. Then a low, rumbling whump echoed through the yard as the kerosene caught. A column of thick black smoke and bright orange flames burst through the roof of the shed. The effect was instantaneous. The infected at the rear of the pack, driven by a primal reaction to the sudden, violent light and sound, began to spin around. They let out a chorus of raspy, excited shrieks and began to shuffle toward the burning structure, their arms outstretched. "The pressure is dropping," Gavin yelled over the roar of the fire. "Now, Marcus, move in." We broke from the silo, weapons raised, stepping into the open air of a dead world. The cold air rushed into my lungs as we sprinted across the frost-bitten grass. The heat from the burning tool shed rolled across the yard in violent waves, the smell of acrid kerosene competing with the sickening stench of decaying flesh. Just as we hoped, the rear half of the horde was entirely captivated by the roaring fire, stumbling mindlessly toward the flames. But the front half, roughly 25 infected, remained pinned like a vice against the buckling barn wall, trapped by their own momentum and the terrifying compulsion to reach whatever residual scent of life lingered inside. "Take the left," Gavin roared over the crackle of the fire, raising his 12-gauge. "Keep moving. Don't let them pin you against the perimeter." The first infected to notice us was a man wearing a shredded high school varsity jacket. His eyes were entirely milked over, his bottom jaw hanging loosely from broken tendons. He spun around with a jerky, unnatural speed, letting out a wet, rattling hiss before lunging forward. Gavin didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The blast from the shotgun was deafening in the open yard. A brilliant flash of white-hot powder illuminated the gloom, and the tight spread of lead caught the creature squarely in the chest and throat, throwing its broken body backward into the dirt. Before the shell casing even hit the ground, Gavin pumped the slide, the metallic clack-clack a rhythmic bass line to the chaos. I raised my rifle, aligning the red dot sight with the temple of a female infected who was breaking away from the wall. I squeezed the trigger twice. 2 sharp cracks echoed out, and she dropped instantly, her momentum sending her sliding across the frosted grass. "We need to clear the ones right at the pillar," I shouted, dropping another infected who was shuffling aggressively toward my right flank. We advanced in a tight, coordinated line, our weapons casting a barrier of lead between us and the dead. Gavin was an absolute machine. his military training taking over as he methodically emptied his shotgun, stepped back to reload with smooth, unhurried motions, and stepped forward to fire again. But the dead were completely indifferent to the losses. They didn't feel fear. They didn't look at their fallen comrades and hesitate. They just redirected their hunger toward the newest sound. As the crowd around the eastern wall began to shift toward us, the immense pressure holding the barn wall finally yielded, but not in the way we wanted. With a terrifying, echoing crack, the primary wooden support pillars split completely in two. The structural failure sounded like a bomb going off. The corrugated iron siding sighed violently as the entire eastern section of the barn roof shifted downward by 3 feet. A heavy cloud of old dust, insulation, and splintered wood exploded outward from the gap, blinding us momentarily. "Marcus, the air intake," Gavin yelled, coughing violently through the dust cloud. Through the haze, I saw the disaster unfolding. The collapsing wall hadn't just buckled, it had caved inward, burying the entire ground-level air filtration intake unit under hundreds of pounds of heavy timber, metal sheets, and worst of all, the crushed, writhing bodies of several infected who had been caught beneath the collapse. The external intake fan was completely jammed, its electric motor letting out a high-pitched, agonizing whine from beneath the rubble as it burned itself out. At that exact moment, a sharp, panicked crackle erupted from the radio transceiver clipped to my vest. "Marcus, Gavin, are you there?" Sarah's voice screams through the static, her tone laced with absolute panic. "The control panel is lighting up red, the primary intake line is blocked, and the internal air pressure is dropping. I'm trying to switch to the secondary scrubbing loop, but the valve is stuck. It won't turn. The air down here, it's getting thin, Marcus. I can hear something scraping against the pipes." "Sarah, listen to me," I yelled into the radio. Backing up as 3 more infected emerged from the dust cloud, their gray hands reaching for my throat. I fired from the hip, dropping the closest one, while Gavin stepped in to smash the butt of his shotgun into the face of the second. "You need to use the emergency override wrench under the main console. Force the valve clockwise. Do you hear me? Clockwise." "I'm trying, it won't budge," she sobbed. "We have to get back down there," Gavin said, his face slick with sweat and soot. He glanced back toward the burning tool shed. The distraction was fading. The intense heat was beginning to cook the infected that had walked directly into it, and the remaining stragglers were turning back toward the sound of our gunfire. "We're about to get surrounded out here, and your girl is running out of oxygen." "The silo hatch," I said, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We fall back to the silo, seal the hatch behind us, and get back to the bunker through the crawlway. "You go," Gavin said, shoving another shell into his shotgun. "I'll anchor the line. Move." We began a fighting retreat back toward the concrete silo, but the dead were closing in from 3 sides now. The collapse of the barn wall had freed up the remaining horde from the front yards, and they were pouring around the corner of the building, like water through a broken dam. I turned to fire at a cluster of 3 infected blocking our path to the silo door. 1, 2, 3 shots. They dropped, but as the final one fell, my rifle bolt walked back. Empty. Before I could reach for my sidearm, a heavy, decaying weight slammed into my side, knocking me completely off my feet. I hit the frozen ground hard, the breath exploding from my lungs in a white plume. I looked up, staring straight into the milky, bloodshot eyes of what used to be a local delivery truck driver. His mouth was stretched open in a silent, horrific scream, a thick, black fluid dripping from his blackening gums straight down toward my face. His rotten fingernails dug into the fabric of my tactical vest, pinning me to the earth. I flailed, trying to draw my 9mm pistol from its holster, but my arm was pinned beneath his weight. The stench of his decay was overpowering, filling my nose, making my eyes water. His snapping jaws were inches from my throat. "Gavin," I choked out. A sudden sharp shadow fell over us. But it wasn't Gavin. A heavy iron crowbar swung through the air with terrifying precision, catching the infected driver directly under the jaw. The force of the blow tore the creature off me, throwing its limp body to the side. I scrambled backward, looking up in shock. Standing over me wasn't Gavin, it was Sarah. She was breathing heavily, clutching the iron crowbar, her face covered in sweat, her eyes wide with a manic survivalist fury. She had overridden the vault door from the inside and crawled through the pipe to find us. The valve didn't open, she gasped, offering me a bloody, calloused hand to pull me up. So I brought the wrench, and I wasn't gonna die in a hole alone. I grabbed Sarah's hand, the rough canvas of her work gloves scraping against mine as she yanked me to my feet. My ribs ached from the fall, but there was no time to bleed. "Are you insane?" I yelled over the roar of the burning shed, immediately pulling my 9mm pistol and dropping an infected that was staggering toward her back. "You left the bunker unsecured? The secondary loop was dead, Marcus," she screamed back, her voice cracking with a mix of terror and defiance. The air down there turned heavy in 90 seconds. I was going to pass out on the floor. I had to use the manual release on the escape hatch, or suffocate. Gavin stepped into our perimeter, his shotgun blaring one last time before clicking empty. He didn't waste time reprimanding her. He saw the tactical reality. We were 3 living souls standing in a triangle, surrounded by a closing circle of rotting flesh. "Silo, now," Gavin roared, grabbing Sarah by the shoulder of her jacket and shoving her toward the concrete structure. We sprinted the last 10 yards, sliding through the broken wooden door of the silo. Gavin and I slammed the heavy timber door shut, throwing a thick wooden crossbar over the brackets, just as 3 infected slammed into the outside with the force of a car crash. The wood groaned, dust exploding from the seams. "Down the hatch, Sarah. Go," I ordered, pointing to the open steel plate in the floor. She didn't hesitate this time. She dropped the crowbar down the hole, grabbed the iron ladder, and slid down into the dark crawlway. Gavin went next, his heavy boots clanging against the rungs. I scrambled in last, pulling the heavy steel silo hatch down over my head and spinning the locking wheel from the inside. Instantly, the chaotic sounds of the surface, the roaring fire, the shrieks, the pounding on the wood became muffled, replaced by the heavy echoing sound of our own frantic breathing in the narrow concrete pipe. We crawled back through the narrow pipe in reverse order. I was in the lead now, pushing through the darkness with my flashlight illuminating the gray concrete. But as we neared the end of the line, where the pipe opened into the bunker's rear utility room, a sickening realization hit me. The air inside the pipe was changing. It wasn't crisp anymore. It smelled sour, thick, and distinctly of burnt electrical insulation. I dropped through the utility hatch into the bunker and immediately began to cough. The air was a hazy gray soup. Up on the surface, the collapsing barn wall hadn't just buried the intake vents. The friction and the severed wiring from the barn's upper grid had sparked a smoldering fire in the insulation right above our air filtration housing. The pumps were still trying to pull air, but instead of oxygen, they were drawing toxic, synthetic smoke from the burning ruins directly into our lifeboat. "Don't breathe it in," I choked out, pulling the collar of my shirt over my nose. Gavin dropped down beside me, his eyes instantly watering from the smoke. "Where are the respirators, Marcus? Tell me you have masks." "Medical locker, in the main living quarters." We stumbled through the heavy door into the main room. The emergency lights were flashing a steady, rhythmic crimson, casting long, demonic shadows across the stainless steel counters. The console was chiming an annoying, high-pitched alarm. Critical air quality failure. Sarah dropped to her knees, hacking violently. The smoke was settling at head height, turning the ceiling into a rolling sea of black soot. I bolted to the medical locker, threw it open, and grabbed 3 emergency civilian gas masks. I threw one to Gavin, slapped one over Sarah's face, pulling the rubber straps tight until she could breathe, and then secured my own. The world went quiet, replaced by the loud, mechanical whoosh shh of my own breath passing through the charcoal filter. Through the glass visor, the bunker looked like a submerged submarine, drowning in a sea of gray ash. Gavin walked over to the main console, wiping a layer of soot off the glass monitors. The external cameras were still operating, though the lenses were coated in a fine layer of gray dust. The eastern wall of the barn was entirely gone, replaced by a massive mound of smoking debris. Dozens of infected were crawling over the rubble like ants on a disturbed hill. They were trapped inside the upper barn structure now, wandering through the ruins of my life. "The air scrubbing system is completely fried." Gavin's voice came through the small radio transmitter built into our masks. sounding tinny and robotic. The filters are clogged with soot. We're breathing the residual air left in the bunker's reserve tanks. How long do we have, Marcus? I walked to the auxiliary life support panel, my hands shaking as I looked at the gauges. The internal volume of this bunker can hold enough oxygen for 3 people for about 6 hours if we don't exert ourselves, I said, my voice hollow inside the mask. But with the smoke contamination, the chemical filters are going to saturate in 2. After that, we're breathing carbon monoxide. Sarah sat on the edge of a bunk, her knees pulled to her chest, her visor reflecting the red flashing emergency lights. We can't go back out through the silo. There were dozens of them heading that way, and we can't stay down here. Then we fixed the problem, Gavin said, his voice flat, completely devoid of fear. It was the tone of a man who had already accepted his death and was just negotiating the terms. The main intake line runs along the ceiling of this bunker before it breaks through the foundation into the barn. There has to be a manual shutoff valve inside the utility room to isolate the external lines entirely. There is, I admitted, but if we shut off the external line, we are entirely sealed. No new oxygen comes in. We live on a ticking clock until the air runs out. It buys us time, Gavin argued, stepping closer, his gloved hand resting on my shoulder. 2 hours of toxic smoke means we die unconscious on the floor. 6 hours of clean, trapped oxygen means we have time to think. We have time to weaponize what's left in this place and clear a path out. I looked at Sarah, then back at Gavin. The lifeboat had become a trap, and our choices were dwindling down to nothing. All right, I said, checking the magazine of my 9mm pistol. Let's shut the world out completely. The air didn't taste like anything once the valve slammed shut. It was just a cold, thin nothingness. Gavin and I had wrenched the massive iron wheel in the utility room until the steel threads bit into the housing, sealing the external air pipes completely. The toxic smoke stopped rolling in from the ceiling vents, but the red emergency lights kept pulsing, a rhythmic heartbeat reminding us that the clock was ticking. 6 hours, down to 5, then 4. We sat in the dim, crimson-washed living quarters of the bunker. Nobody spoke. When you're living on a finite pocket of air, every sentence feels like an expensive luxury. Every breath you draw is a breath stolen from the person sitting across from you. Sarah sat on the floor, her back against the stainless steel cabinet, staring at the monitors. The camera lenses upstairs were completely covered in ash now, showing nothing but a hazy, featureless white. The world above us was dead, buried under the ruins of my barn. Marcus, Sarah's voice crackled through the radio transmitter of her mask. Weak and raspy, it's getting harder to pull a breath. I checked the digital readout on the console. The oxygen level had dropped to 14%. Carbon dioxide was climbing. My head felt heavy, a dull, throbbing ache pulsing right behind my eyes. My fingers were tingling. We aren't going to make it to 6 hours, Gavin said softly. He had taken his mask off, letting it hang around his neck. There was no point in filtering out the smoke anymore. The smoke was gone, replaced by the invisible poison of our own exhalations. The scrubbing chemicals are totally spent. We have maybe 30 minutes before we slip into a coma. I looked at the heavy steel vault door. The lifeboat had become a pristine, indestructible tomb. I spent 5 years building this place, I muttered, my voice echoing hollowly in the small room. 5 years making sure nothing could break in. I never thought about what it would mean if we couldn't get out. Gavin stood up, his joints popping in the silence. He picked up his empty shotgun, using it like a walking stick to steady his faltering balance. So, what's the play, Marcus? Do we lie down on these bunks and go to sleep? Or do we go out swinging? Sarah looked up, her face pale in the red light, but there was no fear left in her eyes. The terror had burned away over the last week, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. She stood up beside Gavin, clutching her iron crowbar. I'm not dying in a hole, she said. I looked at them both. My neighbors had laughed at me. They had called me a madman. But looking at Gavin and Sarah, I realized I hadn't just built a bunker to save myself. I had built it to keep the last fragments of humanity alive for just a little bit longer. And if we died today, we would die as humans, not as things waiting to be eaten. We used the hydraulic lift, I said, a grim energy surging through my veins. cutting through the lethargy of the lack of oxygen. The upper barn doors are blocked by the collapse, but the hydraulic lift under the tractor bay has enough upward force to lift 3 tons. If we override the safety limiters, we can use the lift like a massive jack to punch a hole right through the collapsed roof. Gavin smiled, a sharp, dangerous glint returning to his eyes. A backdoor exit. Let's do it. We huddled in the small airlock chamber beneath the hydraulic lift. I connected the auxiliary battery banks directly to the lift's heavy-duty motor, bypassing every safety protocol I had meticulously programmed into the system. When this platform goes up, the noise is going to bring every infected in the valley straight to us, I warned them, my hand hovering over the manual lever. There is no fallback plan. There is no coming back down. Once we break the surface, we run for the woods, and we don't stop. Gavin loaded his last 3 pistol rounds into his sidearm. I'm ready. Sarah gripped the crowbar, nodding once. Do it. I threw the lever. The hydraulic fluid screamed through the pipes. Beneath our feet, the massive steel platform groaned, trembled, and then began to rise. Up we went, out of the sterile, red-lit sanctuary of the bunker and into the dark, choked cavern of the upper barn. The platform hit the collapsed debris with a deafening, metallic shriek. For a second, the motor whined, smoke pouring from the electrical housing as it fought against hundreds of pounds of fallen timber and corrugated iron. Come on, I prayed, pushing the lever further. Come on. With a violent crunch, the structural debris gave way. The hydraulic lift punched through the collapsed roof like a fist through cardboard, throwing twisted metal and burning wood to the side. The blinding, brilliant light of the midday sun flooded into my eyes, forcing me to shield my face. The air, cold, sharp, and smelling of autumn leaves and wood smoke, rushed into our lungs. I gasped, coughing violently as the pure oxygen hit my starving system, clearing the fog from my brain instantly. But the light also revealed the nightmare. The upper barn was crawling with them. Dozens of infected, their skin gray and sloughing off, turned in unison toward the sudden, violent sound of our ascension. They let out a collective, blood-curdling shriek that echoed off the ridges of the valley. Go, go, Gavin yelled, firing his pistol into the chest of the closest creature as it lunged onto the platform. We scrambled over the twisted metal of the collapsed wall, dropping down onto the frost-covered grass of the backyard. The tool shed was nothing but a pile of smoldering black ash. The fields I had farmed for years were littered with the broken, wandering bodies of the dead. An infected woman, her clothes torn to ribbons, lunged at Sarah from the shadow of the silo. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped inside the strike, swinging the iron crowbar with a brutal, fluid arc that caught the thing squarely in the temple. The creature collapsed into the dirt, motionless. This way, I shouted, pointing toward the dense, unmanaged tree line of the northern woods. There were no roads there, no towns for miles, just miles of wilderness and mountains. We ran. Behind us, the horde poured out of the ruined barn, a wave of snapping jaws and reaching hands, but they were slow, hindered by the debris and their own chaotic hunger. We broke through the tree line, the thick canopy of the forest swallowing us whole. As I ran, I took one last look back at the ridge. The Pariah's ark was gone, reduced to a smoking ruin of concrete and twisted iron. The fortress had fallen, the lifeboat was destroyed. But as I looked at Gavin sprinting beside me and Sarah holding the line at my back, I realized something. The bunker hadn't failed. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had bought us enough time to survive the end of the world. And now, the real story was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. Drop a comment down below telling me what you would have done in Marcus's shoes, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of the outbreak.